welcome back to another Meet the Author. We've got a great conversation in store for you today. So Gary, I'm going to throw it right to you. And why don't you share who do we have with us as a guest today on Meet the Author?
Okay, thanks, Tamara. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us. The book we're going to talk about, and you can see in my background, is Meltdown: Why Our Systems Fail and What We Can Do About It. It was written in 2018 by two authors, Chris Clearfield and Andres Tilchik. I'm really pleased today that we have one of the authors here today, Chris. So welcome, Chris, to our Meet the Author show.
Thank you. I'm very excited. Very excited to be here and honored by the invitation.
Great, thank you. Now, as you know, our format is we don't spend a lot of time, like, who's Chris, what do you do? That's all this bio stuff will be available and it's easy to get. What I do right now is just dive straight into the book itself and ask that very first question. So what made you two decide to write this book? Is there a certain need that you're trying to fulfill?
Yes. I think for me, I'll just talk about my journey, and András's was a little bit different. I have very much the background of a practitioner, so not a safety practitioner, not a consultant, but I was in finance during the financial crisis. So I was a trader during the financial crisis, and so I had this kind of front row seat to the world, falling apart, and just got really interested as that happened in why some organizations seem to manage that crisis much better than others. And I just got really interested in that kind of the sort of heterogeneity of the response to this big unexpected, series of unexpected shocks. But it really wasn't until 2010 when Deepwater Horizon blew up that I was reading about the accident, I was reading about the investigation, I was watching it unfold kind of with horror as many of us were. And it was really then that I realized that, oh gosh, this thing that I've been working with, this connection between complexity and failure and organizational's ability to manage that and to be resilient, like this is a much bigger problem than just finance. This is much bigger than my own kind of niche. And so then at that point, I got very interested in kind of the broader question, the broader ways that complexity was a source of, really a source of risk and a source of failure that I think was and still is underappreciated. And so it was really that led to kind of feeling called to contribute to that discussion. There's a lot of very powerful voices in that discussion, but just feeling called to contribute a sort of a slightly different perspective on it. Grounded in complexity, but also grounded in, okay, so, what can we do about it?
Mm-hmm. Good, right. Well, interesting title that you picked called Meltdown. So where did this term originate from?
Well, I mean, of course, we use the term colloquially, right? So we use it in an engineering sense to describe, what happens when a nuclear reactor goes awry. We use it colloquially to describe, what happens when things don't go as we expect, whether that's in parenting and a kid having a meltdown or, just sort of a kind of a business meltdown. But as we developed the idea for the book, it was actually our agent our literary agent who was like, I think Meltdown is a good title. And it really landed with us. And so we went with it.
Oh, good. Interesting. Well, by your book's title, you've actually taken the book and created two parts. So I'd like to begin with that part one, why our systems fail. And I know that in 1984, Charles Perrault published Normal Accidents. And I really like how you've used his interactions coupling chart to really explain why systems fail. So maybe you can quickly just explain what are the two axes and how are you using it in the book?
Yes, absolutely. Well, so, Perrault, if people don't know, I'm sure a lot of people in this crowd do know him, but Perrault was an organizational scholar who, before he started writing about systems and failure, he was really writing about, deep, what I think of as deep sociology. So, agrarian patterns in, rural areas and how, I think 18th century textile mills and the way that influenced, agrarian patterns and all this stuff. But he got involved in the 3 Mile Island accident investigation, and in doing so, he really started to see kind of disaster as an organizational problem, not just a problem that was kind of inevitable, but a problem that came from the way that these systems were organized, and frankly, the fundamental limits of organizations to manage these. So in Perot's kind of conception, which was drawn on 3 Mile Island and then lots of other cases, he looks at two axes: complexity, which is sort of how much the connections within the system matter, how much those connections are kind of more important than the parts, and there's sort of the density of the connections. And we also kind of thought of that as how opaque the system is. How hard is it to understand what's going on at any given moment? And then the other axis is tight coupling. It's basically how much slack do you have in the system when there is something that goes wrong, when there is that kind of challenge to the system. Does it return to equilibrium, or is it off and running, and is it hard for people to stop? And that tight coupling, that can be in time, it can be in kind of resources. So there's lots of different dimensions that you can think about your system as being tightly coupled. But a kind of easy way to think about it is like, if an operator understands what's going on, be that a chief financial officer or somebody who's sitting in front of a control panel, do they actually have the time and capacity to kind of intervene in the system? And if they don't, then, and it's complex, then Perot's statement was that there was kind of a normal accident that was inevitable. Our statement is a little bit softer, but kind of using his framework to sort of look at all kinds of systems and say, just the risk of these systems is higher. The risk of these unexpected events kind of spiraling out of control is higher. So that's the lens that's the way we kind of built on Perot's framework.
Yeah, and then if you look at these two axes, you can see that you can create this almost like a 2x2 matrix, right? And then in the bottom left corner, if you can visualize that, are the organizations that, okay, they're kind of looser, they're more linear, not a problem. But that's that area in the top right that we're really interested in.
Right.
Where there's really tight coupling and really high complexity. And I think that's where a lot of the systems fail. And in some cases, we don't even know why they fail because it's so
right.
complex.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Well, your book, it's full of great details, ranging from failures, which many of us on this call are familiar with, such as you mentioned, Deepwater Horizon. But then you talked a bit about the Washington Metro train system. And then you also include past meltdowns with no physical harm, but still plenty of damage. What are some of these are right? The Night Capital meltdown. Starbucks had a meltdown with their Twitter feed. The UK Post Office, of course, our favorite Enron. And even the funny one, which we all kind of shook our head at, and we all saw it on TV, was the Academy Awards, Oscars meltdown that they had as well. Like, oh my God. Now, this book you wrote is 3 years ago. So what I'd like to do is bring everybody up to speed to today. And let's talk a bit about some of those meltdowns that we're seeing now, such as, well, in the US, we're all watching the world, the January 6th Capitol insurrection. What happened there? We notice there's anti-vaxxers and their actions. We have an extinction and rebellion. And then on the nature side, we've got wildfires. And of course, what we're being experienced here in the Northwest is flooding with something called atmospheric rivers. So what are your thoughts? Can you bring us up to speed? Why are these meltdowns and what's different about them?
Well, I think a lot of them, I mean, if we just choose one, which, let's just call it more broadly sort of misinformation, right? Which is a sort of, it's funny, the book launch, the day the book launch was the same day that the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal broke. And if you remember that, I mean, that's like 1,000 scandals ago, so it might be hard to remember. But if you remember that, it was, Facebook selling or basically allowing people to access user data in a way that allowed them to deliver very targeted political ads and kind of run this influence campaign. And so, I think if you even just start with this idea of misinformation and look at Facebook and Twitter and the way that these platforms are engineered, sort of by definition creates unexpected connections, right? I mean, they're kind of made to create unexpected connections and to bring people to information that will keep them engaged, not necessarily bring them to information that will, enrich their understanding of a particular situation. And so you get this kind of drive towards outrage on these platforms. And I think one of the things we're seeing is that, to some extent they were engineered in this way, but to another extent, they are behaving in a way that is has consequences that are well beyond what their creators, designers intended or anticipated. And so, you kind of look at like Zuckerberg will go before Congress, and I'm not going to be able to quote him off the cuff, but basically his kind of stance is like, look, it's a social good to have people connected. We're connecting people, we're performing a social good. And yet you look at the empirical reality of it, and it's like I'm not sure that the way that you're connecting people is a social good. And I think that there is a real responsibility to be connected with the complexity of our systems and to acknowledge and understand that when they don't behave as we expect, when they do kind of throw off these deleterious consequences, these externalities, then that's really a sign for us to wake up and pay attention to them in a different way.
Yeah, right. So anybody out there, any readers, do you have any comments, thoughts about some of the meltdowns that we're seeing today? Anybody want to raise their hand and maybe make a comment? What about your own backyard at home? Any systems that you're seeing are failing on your part? Do you have anybody out there? Put up your hand or open up your mic and chat.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind throwing in a comment, Gary. The thing, nothing in particular, but what really gets me about this is the speed with which technology is driving the world, and the small groups of people that are in control of that train and how fast that train is moving. And so the thing that's really getting me is that we are sold something or told something, and it's embedded into our business very, very quickly. It gets adopted very quickly. And it's almost like the bus leaves the station before people realize what direction it's going. So like Chris mentioned earlier, there's these unintended consequences. And before we can even absorb and understand what's happening and to really embed it in our processes, already it's outdated, it's changed direction. Somebody has taken us now, the bus is going in a different direction, or it's not supported in some way. And that's the thing that scares me is, if a video game doesn't work for kids playing with it and it doesn't get supported next Christmas, okay, that's one thing. But when that's embedded into how our industrial platforms are built or how our emergency services are built, that's the thing that is really terrifying to me, is that it's moving at a rate, there's no possible way that, and I know I'm of the older generation, but how can we possibly stay with this pace, and where does it end? So I'll leave that just for a discussion.
Good. Tom, you got a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I apologize, I haven't read Chris's book, but I've been interested in complex and the systems approach. And I think they're two different things. One is looking at industrial accidents or accidents as a systems failure, but also recognizing some systems are genuinely much more complex. And I guess my definition is, one of the things about systems is they behave in very non-intuitive ways. They do unpredictable things, and the more complex they are, the more unpredictable. And in a sense, industrial accidents like 3 Mile Island, like Deepwater Horizon, are a good algorithm almost for wider society. We're starting to see it with global warming. I think 10 years ago, people thought it was going to be gradual flooding, and actually it turns out extreme weather events are coming at us much more soon. And I guess my question is that I think it's very easy with hindsight to look at accidents and say a systems perspective, a complex system perspective gives you a very good insight. What's much harder is to persuade traditional managers, successful managers particularly, and traditional organizations. And actually everyone in organizations likes to think in very mechanistic ways. And so I think it's easy with hindsight, but my question is, how do we use this to help us understand before the accident happens, but we should be changing our behaviors more. It's how do we get that message across before the accident happens, not after the accident happens. Hindsight bias is very powerful, but sharing that insight is the challenge for me.
That's a great segue into part 2, which we really want to spend a lot of time in, so what we can do about it. But before we do there, I just want to hang a bit longer in this part 1 about why systems fail. Does anybody else have any other comments, thoughts about that?
I do want to jump in and just, I mean, first, thank you, Gordon, for your comment, because I think there's really something there about, you know, you talked about the pace of change, but I also hear really the need to support change in an explicit way, and the need to, you know, yes, if you get a new platform in, boy, you've got to train people on that, and like, you really need the people that are closest to the problems of a system, or, you know, just closest to a problem, being involved in the development and the integration of that system. And it's sort of, I'm often struck by the amount of times that doesn't happen. And then you get these big problems as a result, because there are these big kind of mismatches between what people actually need a system to do and what it does. And so much of that, I think, just comes from not connecting with the wisdom of the people that are closest to the challenge, which I think is one of the themes that we talk about in the book quite a bit. And you know, with Tom, I think in many ways you are asking the question that I've spent the last 5-6 years thinking about as I kind of started to move seriously into this space, and said, well, hang on, like, let's take a look at Deepwater Horizon. Let's take a look at these organizations that are operating these complex systems, and let's understand why it is that they're not as sensitive to these things. And one of the conclusions, I mean, I guess I have two conclusions from it. One is that I find it very effective to, and sort of brazenly unscientific, but very effective to engage leaders with stories instead of with data. I think what a lot of people do, particularly, engineering, I work with a lot of engineers, and a lot of what I do is help folks who are very left brain and very analytical get in touch with their right brain, right? Get in touch with, okay, what is the person I'm talking with? What do they care about? How do I deliver this message with what I call practical empathy, right? So I'm understanding that they have needs, and that if I can speak to those needs, then I can be very powerful. So right now, for example, I'm working with a safety team on kind of a helping them supporting their leader as she guides a real transformational change, how they work with themselves, how they work with other groups, how to elevate their conversation. So they're not at the level of helping people tick boxes, but they're really giving safety ownership to the operators. So you can just hear that there's a lot of stakeholders involved in this. There's a lot of big changes. And one of the things we're doing is just thinking very, very carefully about, what are the stories that we can tell to a group of operators who are sort of a group of business owners, really, to land this, why this change is important for them, right? Because yes, it's we want to have more efficient processes, and we want to have work-life balance amongst the safety team, but the management, as much as they like the safety people and they kind of care about them as humans, it's like, well, if that's the only problem, then just hire more safety people, right? Like, you don't need to change the way we work with you. But if they understand, on a deeper level, like, look, what we're trying to do is create a work environment that's going to be safer, more reliable, more on schedule, all of these things that are kind of how to land using stories of other places that have failed and succeeded, how to land this message that this is actually something that's important to attend to. So yeah, it's something that a lot of my work kind of, especially since thinking about complexity and then realizing that it wasn't the thing that had a lot of management's attention. So a lot of what I've done is think about how do I kind of, how do I frame these things in a way that people care about?
Right. So, Tanya, got a comment?
Actually, I think it might have been addressed in what Chris was just saying there, but I was, a lot of this kind of stuff, I am starting to wonder if it has really deep roots in our, Western paradigm of thinking kind of thing. When Chris was talking about storytelling and trying to get people in touch with their so-called right brain. There is a lot of resistance to change, the allure of the status quo, notwithstanding people being attracted to the iPhone and things like that. They're technologically, we seem to have a great acceptance of change, but there are, in other spheres, we seem not to be quite so accepting of it. And I'm wondering if that, as Chris, I think fairly stated, Perot was looking at looking at 3 Mile Island in a much different way than other analysts were doing, looking at the much larger sociological view in a paradigm that I think makes people uncomfortable, because it's starting to question way
Yes.
more than what we feel comfortable questioning.
Yes. Yes, I just want to support that, Tanya. Like, that's such an insightful comment. And I'm going to say some words and you tell me if that lands with what you're saying. Like, a lot of safety is actually a conversation about safety is actually a conversation about power. It's a conversation about who has power, who has the power to say yes, who has the power to say no. And what Perot does is, in his work, is he, and somewhat explicitly too, he starts to say, look, you want to blame these operators, but I don't want to be salty here, but that's just stuff rolling down the hill, right? Like, you've chosen the people with the least structural power to blame. Actually, you've got to look at this from a societal level. You've got to look at it from an organizational level. And so power is uncomfortable. We don't really like to talk about it, but it's a lot of what I end up talking about with the people I work with, because you have to, power is it's scary and it's uncomfortable, but it's not bad. I mean, it exists, and we actually want to work on change in systems. We have to be very, very clear that about how power works and that it's there.
Yeah. Okay. Tom, I know you got your hand up, but I'm just going to ask you if you could just hang on to that, because I'm mindful that Chris is only with us through the top of the hour. And I really want to get into this, I think, the cool part, which is part 2. What can we do about it? And this is, of course, the reason why the book was written. When I was reading part 1, it made me think about that complexity phenomenon, hidden patterns of order. And as you found out, Chris, hey, this is happening here. It's happening over here. There's this pattern that seems to be repeating these things here. You mentioned in the book that Charles Perot said that safety systems are the biggest source of catastrophic failure in complex, tightly coupled systems. What did he mean by that? It's all counterintuitive.
Well, yes. But I bet it is counterintuitive, but it's also quite intuitive. And I bet if you're on the screen and you just nod if this resonates with you, I mean, when there's a problem, when something goes wrong in a system, I mean, the tools that people reach for are often additive, right? It's like, oh, well, this went wrong. Let's add another check here. Or like, now we need another piece of documentation to make sure that people have completed this step. And, the truth is, at the margin, every one of those decisions seems reasonable. But when you think about it from a systems level, you start to get just, again, more and more complexity. And there's a particular case we talk about in the book of an overdose at UCSF, the University of California, San Francisco, their pediatric hospital, or with a pediatric patient at their hospital. And, they are just a world-class clinical institution, and yet they had a system that created the space for a patient to get a 38-fold antibiotics overdose. And he had a seizure and fortunately recovered. But, you look at that system and it was just a system of check after check after check, and a pharmacy robot, and, the kind of operator level of the nurse sort of going forward, even despite her uneasiness. And then you've got the questions of, are people empowered to speak up? But one of the most interesting things was the physician who writes about this writes about how the response in the meeting, like, oh, we had this bad thing happen. Well, what do we need to do? Well, we want to add another check. And so, and yet the problem is that there's more, we have so many checks that we're just adding complexity to this system. And so if you think about it from a systems perspective, if you think about from Perot's axis, then what you see is that complexity can, or checks and safety systems can actually add risk, particularly when they're bolted on, right? It's also, I think that when you look at the design of the 737 MAX, it's the same kind of thing. Like the system that's added on that is not totally thought through, not totally integrated. I mean, that's a source of a tremendous amount of challenge and error.
Yeah, good. I think what you touched upon is something we actually spoke about last month with Jim. And I think, Jim, you're online when we talked about critical steps and just looking at different things within the process. And are we actually adding this extra level of complexity and complicatedness, if I can use that word, and just makes it much more difficult for the workers to actually execute. It really does. All right. Okay. Now, complex systems are sometimes referred to as wicked environments because they have problems that we just can't seem to understand. And the effects of our decisions and to learn, and basically to learn from them, often fails us. But you got a really good portion of the book where you talk about various tools that you can use to navigate all kinds of wicked environments. I don't know if you have the time to go through your big list, but would you like to pick out a couple of your favorites to talk about?
Yes. Yeah, thanks for the question, Gary. And I just want to take a step back by kind of teeing up the concept a little bit. And, you know, I was yesterday reading a book on strategy, and one of the questions that the author is talking about is when can you, this is sort of more general business strategy, but when can you use intuition to kind of help inform and develop your strategy? You know, it's this when you think about the strategy of a business or even a functional unit, like a safety team, you know, what do they want to be great at and how are they going to be great at it? Those are the sort of two questions I think of. And that's, you know, Roger Martin, who's the former dean of the Rotman School at the University of Toronto. He's written just a tremendous amount on strategy and just great stuff. But one of the things I think about is, you know, intuition. Intuition comes from getting immediate feedback from your environment. So the best kind of feedback is, you know, thinking about is when you watch a kid who's learning to walk, right? They're kind of constantly falling, getting up, trying something new, constantly falling, getting up. They are educating their intuition about how to walk. Now, I think the problem is that as humans, it's very easy to be overconfident. And so as we get experience in our work, we tend to continue to value our intuition. But a lot of the bigger problems we have to face, we really want to face them from kind of an experimental stance or an experimental standpoint, rather than a standpoint of, oh, here's my gut feeling, here's how we're going to move forward. And yet, you know, I said before, I work with a lot of engineers, a lot of left brain people. And one of the challenges that we often get to is, you know, when you're making business decisions, a leader might make decisions about the direction the company is going to go or the direction of a particular strategy. And after a year or two, you may not know, was that even the right decision, right? You may not have good data on it. And so when I think about intuition, I think about you have to be operating in an environment with high feedback. Otherwise, it's an environment that you don't learn from. And I think one of the challenges is when we take our intuition and we apply it in these environments about a complex system, about change, about a new strategy, without really ever being in the loop where we're getting that feedback and we can kind of adjust and learn our intuition over time. And so that's when I think, you know, broadly speaking, that's when tools really come in handy. Tools about, you know, how do you encourage people to estimate out of their comfort zone? So we have a section about that. Tools on, you know, even something simple like, you know, how do you think about, instead of getting people locked into positions arguing about a direction that you should go, how do you think about, you know, what are the properties of a useful direction to go? What would have to be true for a strategy to be a great strategy? And then, you know, what are the, like, if you have a couple of choices, you can just score them along those criteria that you've developed. And now all of a sudden you have shifted people out of advocating for a position to kind of advocating for the we, or, you know, sort of advocating for the best thing that is going to be true for the system, the organization, the group, by flipping that around. So that, you know, that's at a high level, and we go in you know, significantly more depth in the book. But I think that's a nice flavor of kind of how we thought about that, and frankly, why we thought it was important for thinking about complex systems, because there really is this break where your intuition just doesn't work.
Yeah, yeah. You actually have a great piece on talking about Gary Klein and his Primordia method.
Yep.
And Tom, this ties in, I think, with your question asked. So what can we do to prevent a meltdown from happening? So would you like to kind of explain what Gary talks about there, Chris?
Yes. Yeah, Gary's work is really interesting, because Gary is talking about intuition, right? I mean, he is writing about what I was just saying, and it really is, when you think about, the research on like Gary Klein's research on intuition and how to apply it, and then you hold that up against like Kahneman and Tversky and prospect theory and these kind of, this irrationality, this kind of human irrationality, cognitive biases, that's what we call it. You see this kind of tension between these two things. And I think it's interesting, because I think in part the tension resolves itself by just how do you think about the system you're operating in? Is it a system where your intuition is going to help you or harm you? And so one of the techniques that Gary Klein and his team use is this technique called the Primordia, which is basically saying, the chief limitation of a postmortem, yes, we can learn from incidents, we can learn from accidents, but the chief limitation is that bad thing has already happened, right? So how do we get ahead of it? And what Gary talks about is this idea of prospective hindsight. So you ask a question, imagine it's 6 months from now, imagine it's a year from now, whatever the right time frame is. And it turns out that, our system has failed in a horrible and dramatic way. And actually, when I'm doing this with groups, I will often put up a little newspaper headline that says, whatever, we did this with the MBAs at the University of Toronto, Rotman suffers devastating setback, right? And then you get to think, okay, it's a year from now, what went wrong to cause this failure? What went wrong to cause this problem? And once you're connected with that, it's not brainstorming, right? It's like, given that the failure happened, what was the cause of it? And that really just unlocks people's ability to be both more specific and more creative. And you get people to really uncover deeper, more important risks.
Yeah. And some of you on the call may recognize the Primordia method, spoken about as red teaming. That was developed by the US military and intelligence agencies after 9/11, because there were a lot of signals that were out there, and people couldn't connect the dots and see them. And the other one that I've been reading about is how Israel uses it. They have a concept called the 10th man. And this is making sure, and they actually have a person dedicated, say, okay, you 9 generals, whatever, agree. I want somebody to disagree with that, and make that very conscious and deliberate, just to kind of make sure that we understand that is there anything that we've kind of missed at all? Okay. All right. Now, you've dedicated a whole chapter on the anatomy of dissent. I really love this, because since you were saying it's no longer disrespectful to question the decisions of a superior. And I think most of us, we've been talking about this thing, and we do it under that title called psychological safety, right?
Yep.
Speaking up and the willingness to hear bad news. I like how in your research, you kind of shared 3 lessons that you discovered, how dissent becomes part of the culture. Can you kind of go into that for us?
Well, can you remind me what the 3 lessons are? Because the book is probably fresher in your brain than it is in mine at that level of detail.
Number 1 was charm school.
Yep.
Number 2 was soften power cues. And the 3rd one was leaders speak last.
Yes. So the charm school bit is about aviation, and is about this development of this idea of crew resource management, which is really a structured way to introduce dissent into the system, introduce noise into the system, and to kind of decouple structural power from decision-making input at any given time. And what I think about it is very interesting. It is, I've been in a lot of organizations where, they'll have a really nice plaque in their conference room that says, one of their values is that their teams speak up when they see something wrong, or coworkers speak up when something's not right. And I remember being in a meeting with some senior folks at an organization and looking at that plaque and saying, you got the direction on this backwards, right? The idea isn't you need to get people to speak up, it's that you need to get managers to listen when they hear bad news. And so, that, I think that framing really puts, you can train people to listen, right? You can train people to be more open. And crew resource management is just a very interesting way to, that we see that being done in aviation that really changed the dynamic and created dramatically safer outcomes. And then, of course, that kind of ties into what Tanya and I were talking about earlier, which is this idea of power and of, so many leaders don't realize the amount of power that is just vested in their position, vested in their, the way that they talk, the way that they operate, the way that they take up space. In their gender, in their race. I mean, there's just lots of ways that power gets embedded into a person, and we're very often unaware of that. We're often unaware of how it changes our behavior. And so the kind of idea here is that, a lot of managers will say, a lot of leaders will say, I have an open door policy, and then sort of leave it at that. And the suggestion is, that's just not enough, right? It's just not enough to say you have an open door policy. You've really got to be going out there in the organization and digging in and understanding things. You've really got to be rewarding people for dissent, even if you don't agree with them. And even if you don't take the action they wanted you to take, you really have to highlight the fact that they spoke up and to celebrate that. As a leader, it is your job to get input from the people that are closest to the problem. And there's a real humility in being willing to do that, and a real willingness to say, I don't have the answer, which I think is a real challenge for many, many leaders who are promoted for having the answer and who are kind of, rewarded for having the answer. So that's, I think, a kind of, that covers those things. I'm curious, Tom, your hand is up. I'm on the edge of my seat. I'm curious what you've got.
Got to find unmute. It's interesting you talk about crew resource management, because I think one of the things that crew resource management is very powerful about, and I've become obsessed with reading about aviation incidents, and it's very good at managing the short-term interaction. It's very focused on what happens in the cabin over the, if you like, the hours of the flight and the minutes of the incident. But one of the things about a lot of the accidents that you've talked about is that the causes go back years and years and years. And particularly if you're involved in design operations, that some of the changes have effects years later. Someone changes an operating parameter and then you get the failure a year or 2 or 3 later. Change the organization, it's only 5 years later that. And I just wondered how you recommend the sort of long-term version of crew resource management. Because crew resource management is very specific, trainable, and I can see how it works short term, but I haven't got my head around how to do that long term.
Right. I think I get your question, and I think it's a great question. And what I would say is I often see these things as I probably use the word fractal with my clients too often. And what I mean by that is you've got this embedded in a dynamic between two people or a team is whether the leader is open to feedback, whether people are encouraged to speak up. And that's that kind of micro level of crew resource management that you're talking about. But then you zoom out to an organization, a division, an installation, a site, and well, now all of a sudden you've got kind of the same question, like, is this system, and I'm going to include the people in that, is the system open to learning? Is this system open to feedback? Do they have structures in place that let them take that learning in and use it to kind of invite improvement, use it to change how people are working together. And so it's, I think, a different, it's the same, it's the same kernel in the middle of both of those, which is really a kernel of humility, recognizing the limits of expertise, recognizing that people can go without kind of interruption and strategic dissent. People can go down the wrong path for a long time, just kind of how our brains work. We're very comfortable with, taking the first option that we think about, and we can get stuck in that and all of those things. And you take that kernel of like humility and learning and that being your stance, and you expand it to the organizational level, now all of a sudden you've got this kind of, like higher level version of crew resource management oriented around listening, learning, and changing course when appropriate. And then of course, you can imagine that on an industry level too, right? Industry, working together, regulators really regulating from this stance of learning rather than a stance of reactivity. I know that there's some ways in which that feels like a fantasy, but we also see places where it happens. So yeah, is that helpful, Tom? Does that feel responsive?
I guess one of the challenges is that how you get that culture when it's very difficult to learn. I mean, there's been some chat on the comments that the children falling learn quickly because they've got a safe way of falling. And I think it's interesting if you compare what happened in my industry 30 years ago, we saw losses of containment. I remember talking to drillers when we were kind of trying to get to the bottom of Deepwater Horizon. Most drillers sort of over 60 experience kicks and losses of control weekly, monthly. We'd all seen blowouts. It happened. If you talk to the people now, it's one a decade, and they're not just fewer, they've got massive consequences, but that means that you haven't got a feel for it. So I think that there are ways of changing the culture, and I think it's quite interesting what you're saying. That could be very powerful, but we've also got to recognize that we're learning beings, and when there's this huge time lag, learning is very hard. I mean, someone said to me once, that's why losing weight is hard, because it takes 6 months before you see any effect. Very delayed feedback gives a very difficult system to improve. And same count, you don't see it degrading. So it's
Totally.
kind of absence of short-term feedback, absence of how do you learn safely without getting diverted. And one of the challenges of the incidents that you're talking about, and certainly BP was quite justifiably criticized, they were obsessed with personal safety, which actually became a distraction. Being brilliant at personal safety can actually degrade your major risk control. So it's, I wonder whether you've seen that. You optimize one loop and degrade another one.
Yeah, and that's the nature of complex systems. Everything is so entangled. It always reminds you of the whack-a-mole sort of thing. You bang this one down and something else pops up, so you try to bang that one, but things keep on popping. And that's honestly the definition of a wicked environment. These are problems that maybe are not resolvable. What we've got is a great conversation, and it makes me think of this other complexity phenomenon that nature uses called diversity. So how can, Chris, diversity help us avoid failure in a complex world?
Well, I'm aware that Gordon has something to say, and I want to make sure we have space for that.
Okay.
Gordon, do you want to chime in now? Before
I think I'll just hold my thought there, because Tom raised some really good points there, but I'll just hold my thoughts and let you answer your question then.
Great.
That's great.
So what I was going to say, so diversity, I mean, we're actually kind of talking about it now. One of the things that is just really shines through just empirically in the research is that just more diverse teams perform better on complex tasks. So in complex environments, more diverse teams, and I'm talking about, surface level diversity, age, gender, race, but also subject matter diversity. Are people experts in the same thing? Do you have a group of, is everybody an engineer? Is everybody an oil and gas engineer? Or do you have people from different backgrounds? And one of the things that we know about homogeneous teams is they really give each other the benefit of the doubt. Somebody will say something and the other people, either because they don't want to look dumb or because they think, well, that person must know what they're talking about. There's just less challenge, and there's just less kind of incorporation of additional ideas and noise in the system. And so one of the ways that we know that we can get better outcomes, particularly in complex environments, is by having better inputs, having a diverse group of people that are kind of diverse enough that it doesn't feel like a tokenizing phenomenon, and that people are authentically have the space to speak up and to share their views. And that, again, like we were talking about with CRM, that speaking up, that speak up culture is really kind of respected and valued, and it's not people aren't incorporated for just the purpose of being a dissenting voice, but they're really a participant in the process.
Right. Gord, did you have a comment there?
Yeah, I was trying to formulate my thought there when Tom was speaking, but it's interesting when we talk about left brain and right brain, and I'm not educated in neurology to the point that some people are for sure. But the thing that gets me, if we're talking about left brain as people that are more engineered minded or more.
Oh, did Gord freeze out there?
Just at the wrong moment. I'm sure his connection was perfect the whole rest of the time.
Yeah. Unexpected consequences. Here we go. Good example. Hopefully not quite a meltdown, but that's what happens. Anybody else have a comment, question? I'm going to put Jim Ernest on the line, if you don't mind, Jim. How do you see this stuff we're talking about, meltdown, connect with your book that you guys wrote and Critical Steps? Hey, Jim.
Significant.
Oh, you got to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah. Are you there? Yeah.
I did.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's a significant complementary nature. Knowing what to have ongoing conversations about is very important.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to populate those with the right types of folks, having a good understanding of the variability of your work, and then bringing all that together so you can have those ongoing conversations. Very relatable, I think.
Great. All right. Yeah, thanks. George, you're back on.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, the main point I wanted to make was we need more whiteboard time where people can discuss in that storytelling environment back and forth, where your brain is flowing the information, and where you can imagine, and your brain is much freer, and you can think and talk and propose things, and that's where you can imagine what could go wrong, where something might be. And that's where I think we're missing, because we focus so much on meeting, KPIs or project timelines, and what it does, it just shuts people down who have that ability to whiteboard collaborate. That's kind of what I was thinking.
Right.
That's what Tom's thoughts raised to me.
Okay.
And excuse me, one of the things that when I'm working with leaders or a leadership team, particularly on a big change, or I'll call it transformational, like a real impactful transformational change. So one of the things that I help them do is to attend to the process of work as much as the content of the work. So most of us are very good about jumping in, and we've got opinions on content. We think that this thing should be designed in this way and this thing should be designed in this way, but most of us don't spend nearly enough time really connecting with, well, how do we want to have this conversation? How are we going to hear from make sure people aren't being left out of the conversation? How are we going to call on people and kind of create space for their voice to be heard? How are we going to take all of these ideas from a very divergent group and converge on kind of something practical that we're going to do next? And those are kind of, those are sort of meta questions, right? They're sort of questions about how we work together and what we're doing. But I think that they're so important and so powerful. And, when I think about, to Gord's point there, what that brought up for me was, this discussion about risk on deep water. I mean, some of that was, through email with somebody saying, well, we don't have the right pieces, but I'm sure we'll be fine. Or, even if you go back to Challenger and the kind of infamous conference call that kind of everybody has probably read about. It's like, gosh, I wonder, would that have had a different outcome if those people were in the room together and they had been able, so you sort of have to match the bandwidth of your conversation with the kind of the work you're doing. And I think that's something that's we could all attend to a little bit more. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Tom, Jim, you got your hands up. Who wants to go first?
Can I it's just really a quick challenge to us as a community, I suppose, Chris, because what I'm hearing is you say we need to be facilitating conversations, encouraging people to listen and tell stories and be respectful and really get into the deep stuff, create open space. I think Gary said something, Gordon said something about we need more whiteboard time. And I sense a contradiction between what we're saying in this conversation and certainly what most safety professionals do, and certainly what we're perceived to do out in the field. Follow these rules, stick to that, do this, do the other. We're seen as being a very prescriptive and directive and instructive part of the organization. And what I'm hearing is to manage the complex major consequence events, we need a completely different type of behavior, culture, procedure. So I just wondered how you balance those two, because obviously you can't afford to lose the basics, but there's a real contradictory tension there for me that I'm hearing.
Yeah, and I'll weigh in and say that I think if you look at the work of the Sidney Deckers of the world, of folks like Todd Conklin, procedural safety is very good at managing personnel risk in linear, simple systems, right? And I think more and more safety as a profession is in a position where you really are, your highest best use is to be a trusted advisor on the complexity of the work, right? That's your highest best use. That's one of the ways I would put it. And what that means is really being a facilitator and being a driver of engagement and helping the people that own the benefit also own the risk, right? Because if safety is in opposition to the people that make the business decisions, in some sense, you've already lost, right? You've already lost that conversation. But if you can be a trusted advisor, that's a whole different ballgame. So I'm working with a safety team at a big multinational. They have just unbelievably complex dynamic environments they operate in. And one of the things that's really interesting about it is we're talking about this center of expertise that they are currently investing in and building up. And one of the things that's cool about it is we're having exactly this conversation that, the center of expertise is not about technical approaches to safety. It's not about, how do you promulgate advice on working from height, right? People get that. Yes, you need advice on that. Yes, you need people to be able to kind of draw that in. But more what you need is, how do you facilitate, how do you grow people's capacity on the production side to be safety leaders, to create space for people to speak up, to have those conversations, to create ways of escalating challenge that is not threatening and that does not result in people being blackballed or retaliated against. So that is all safety leadership rather than procedural safety. And I think that is really some of the leaders I get to work with in this space, and I'm not a safety professional, to be clear, but some of the leaders I get to work with who are really, really visionary, this is what they're thinking about. They are thinking about how do you elevate the conversation around safety, and how do you focus on, the safety of work rather than the worker safety, rather than this kind of procedural approach to checking boxes. So I know that was a long answer, and of course we're not going to resolve it in the 3 minutes that we have, but just kind of, give me a nod or a thumbs up. Does that kind of land with you, Tom? Is that kind of the direction you were thinking about? Yeah.
Great. Okay. Jim, you got a quick one? It's getting close to the top of ours, so go ahead, Jim.
I would say that number one, I don't want to take the rest of the time. So just an observation, there are a lot of conversations happening already about the things that matter. and being able to go out in the field and find those folks that are having those conversations and encourage increased participation is something that we found worked real well in the research community.
Good. Thanks. Tamara, you got something to say?
Yeah, I'd kind of build on what's being said. You know, what I found in my experience was really supercharging is when employees did come with an issue or you identified an issue, you know, in order to get buy-in, engaging them in the process, but also understanding that you're not the industry expert on all things. And what you can really do is bring in somebody who is an industry expert to have those discussions with the employees. And it's amazing what I saw with the field workers when I brought somebody in who could answer a lot of the hard questions that I wouldn't have been able to answer. And then they're building that credibility, like, yes, I can actually help you problem solve this. And then they started to create a plan amongst with the workers. And then it was interesting that afterwards, the workers then started to create their own processes in that department in order for dealing with that, and then stuck it up on the wall. And then every time a new individual came in, because I was in retail, as many people know, they were so proud to onboard that new employee about these procedures they had created, right? And the whole essence of this is how we work in this department. It was just transforming in providing that empowerment.
That's great. Okay, so we're nearing the top of the hour, and again, we want to respect that Chris is only with us for a couple minutes. So I'm going to give the last minute to Chris and just ask him, what would be your 3 takeaways you would like to leave the viewers?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you for the conversation. It's been really great and really delightful. And I think, you know, some of the takeaways I'm going to take from the conversation, which is, you know, one, I think something I'll bring in from the book is just that complexity really matters, right? It is just an important problem to attend to. And I think the more people we can get thinking, you know, there's a whole like weird sub ecosystem of us who are obsessed with complexity, right? And the more that we as a kind of network can start to get, particularly, you know, leaders interested in how is the system complex and how does that actually affect things, I think the more power that we have. So one is complexity matters. And then, you know, I think 2 is that, and this has been a thread through our conversation, learning matters also, right? Learning is the most important thing in a modern organization. Thinking about how you can learn, how you can iterate, how you can change your approach to things. This is a tremendously powerful approach to look at the lens of almost any kind of problem. If you're a learning organization, you're going to be growing and changing and adapting. So that's the kind of second thing. And then the third thing I'll attend to is just what we've just been talking about, which is how do you actually create space for that level of conversations, and recognizing that as safety professionals, the opportunity really is to elevate yourself to a trusted partner of the business and a trusted advisor, rather than being on the level of this kind of procedural thing. So yeah, those are the 3 things that I would offer.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris, for joining us for the hour. And thank you for all of the online book club members for joining us today. This will be the last one for 2021. I'd like to say that I don't mind seeing the year go by, and we'll start fresh again in 2022. So happy holidays, everybody. And Tamara, over to you.
Yeah, no, happy holidays, everybody. And thank you so much for joining us on behalf of Safepedia. I'm glad that you joined us today. Thank you.
And folks can find out more about me. Meltdownbook.net there's some information about the book, or chrisclearfield.com. You can email me, chris@chrisclearfield.com. And yeah, I've really enjoyed this conversation and the dialogue, and also people contributing in the chat. So thank you.
And just to bring to people's attention, I did drop both your links in the chat so you can see the book, Chris, and connect with Chris on LinkedIn. And I did that on LinkedIn too in the conversation.
Oh, great.
So click on those And we'll post those onto the site as well.
Right. Okay. Thanks all.
Great. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
All right.
Thanks for the invitation, Gary.
Take
Thanks.
care,
Bye,
Chris.
everybody.
Bye.